Welcome to part 3 of the chapter 34 flipped classroom. And in this part of the presentation, we're going to learn what made World War I different from previous wars and how colonies got involved, how the war spread. So one of the factors that made World War I so different from its predecessors was the enormous scope of the conflict, like how broadly it affected things. This applied not only to the size of armies themselves, but also to the demands that warfare placed on almost every aspect of society. Now, we kind of saw this in World War I in America, but not really. You probably didn't learn about it quite as much. For the first time, people use terms such as total war and home front. Total war is war on both civilians and enemy combatants. So, in a sense, these civilians kind of become enemy combatants. And then the home front is the opposite of the battlefront, right? So it's where you live. And you might remember from United States history people proposing things like victory gardens and saving meat for soldiers. There was a huge push to get the people behind this stuff. Now, one of the reasons for this is because with the industrialization of wars, factories have to run because that's where the weapons are coming from. And guess who makes those weapons? Civilians. So they become legitimate targets because if you stop the factory, you stop the war. Governments also increased dramatically in size and influence. As the war dragged on, volunteer soldiers were replaced by conscripts or drafts. Laissez-faire capitalism, at least during the war years, became a thing of the past. You had to have command economies where factories that maybe before were making pantyhose might make parachutes, or places that were making cars might make tanks. Women enjoyed greater economic advances in the process of supporting this total war, and we'll look at that in just a moment. One of the ways that countries made sure that their people were behind the war effort was propaganda. Many of the things that were spread in propaganda were not true. This is a United States poster. It says, "Destroy this mad brute." In this case, we can tell the brute is German by his hat, and also he has this club that says culture. That's right, so he's going to beat this into us. This is Lady Liberty, and she has been taken by this brute. And over here we have Europe, and now this guy is coming to America, right? And underneath his feet it says America. It says US Army enlist, right? So promoting that. Here's an Australian poster. Again, you see the dehumanization of the enemy, the Germans, the blood coming from Europe, and then here's Australia down here, right? Scary. Here's a German one. This is a British United Kingdom hat here, and it's a cobra, like is located in India. And this says, "Think of your children," right? The British snake is coming for your children. Other interested parties. So the war spread beyond the boundaries of Europe for a couple reasons. First, colonies became natural extensions of the tension among European nations because you had German and British colonies right next to each other. Second, as the war grew in size, the Europeans began to push for colonial recruits, excuse me. Third, other countries entered the war for reasons of national policy that had nothing to do with Francis Ferdinand's assassination or alliance considerations. So we'll talk about Japan in a little bit. But these colonies could also be seen for production and also military strongholds. So places in Africa would be easier to get to by other colonies. Soldiers could seek opportunities to advance from these colonies. And then This is the first time that these colonists or these colonies see their colonists, the Europeans, as ununited and weak. So this kind of gives them ideas about, okay, these people are not the strongest people ever. The working class really gained power because of the need for goods from factories. So this gave unions and other advocates for labor um, a lot of clout because they were so desperately needed for the war effort. And then women, as I said, were a big part of the war effort, both at home and in factories as they moved into production roles. And in the years after the war, many women from many countries like Britain received the vote in some countries, like I said, as a symbol of the contributions they'd made in the war effort. So a lot of times, oh, here we go. Um, this will get into the Japanese thing that I was talking about before. So let's start there. Japan had their own reasons for entering the war. Japan entered the war in 1914 in an attempt, which was eventually successful, to gain control of Germany's Pacific possessions. Eventually, the Japanese used the pretense of war to issue the 21 demands and increase their sway over China. German colonies in Africa, like Togoland, German Southwest Africa, German East Africa, and the Cameroons, became a target for the English and the French. And like I said before, these troops came from these colonies. Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand forces were dragged into the disastrous Battle of Gallipoli, which is in the Ottoman Empire. This was a extremely bloody battle, and I'll show you some amazing pictures from this battle in class, and also um, some of the memorials. Gallipoli was a strategically important place. Winston Churchill was actually the one who planned to invade there. And this battle was a huge disaster for the British, and also very, very bloody for the people who fought there, mainly the Anzac troops, Australia and New Zealand. The battle not only failed to dislodge the Turks, but became a symbol of national sacrifice and identification for Australia, New Zealand, and actually Turkey in the period of independence. Ibn Ali Hussein and T.E. Lawrence also led Arab resistance against Turkish rule in North Africa with the promise of independence. So a lot of times when you think of World War I, you think of European soldiers, but that's not the way the war was completely. There were large portions of troops, especially in certain areas, that were not ethnically European. For example, these Sikh British troops. Sikhs have a long, proud military history, and they fought for the British moving out of India. In Africa, this is the 3rd British Battalion. These are Nigerians. And here are French colonial marine infantry from Cochin, China, fighting in Greece. So now hopefully you understand a little bit more of the interested parties in the war and also those who were how this war is different from the previous wars.